and Wayne Dwyer coined the phrase, the wisdom teachings. As probably most of you know, the wisdom teachings, the ancient ageless wisdom, also known as Theosophy, goes back into the night of time and predates all institutionalized religions, and yet it provides the esoteric core and the substratum of all religions. In my late 20s, that I was experiencing a pivotal time in my life when I was seeking answers to questions regarding the mysteries of life. And at that time, I met a remarkable man who was a deep student of the ancient ageless wisdom. And his name was George. And I met him on a ship, actually. I was a social hostess on a ship, a modest cruise ship going to and fro Alaska. And he was the first officer and I was the social hostess. And here I was in the midst of all my confusion about the mysteries of life. And it turned out that he was a very deep student of these matters, of spirituality. And he started lending me some amazing books. He had a huge library, over 4,000 books, on the subject of Theosophy, the ageless wisdom, history, religions, and so forth. And so he started lending me books on these subjects. So I had a whole pile of books at the side of my bunk. I lived on the ship for 4 months. Anyway, one of the books that he lent me was the Mahatma Letters, all right, which were written the letters were written in the 1880s. And as Hugh mentioned, they were written by 2 Himalayan sages to 2 influential British men, part of the British Raj, living in northern India at the time. Now, these letters eventually ended up in the British Museum, the original letters, and later on they've been transferred to the British Library. But my book, Insights from the Masters, is a compilation of some of the major topics that are relevant for modern day seekers. You see, the letters are not easy to understand in many respects. They're very long, they cover many, many different topics, and they're long paragraphs, but they cover so many fascinating topics. Some of the topics were fairly new for Westerners, because they were deep subjects, many of them subjects that would have been just available to those who had gone through serious disciplines. Some of the topics are as follows. The subject of the oneness of life is a major topic, which runs through really all of the letters, because the Mahatmas, and in the ageless wisdom, the idea of the oneness of life, that there is one great source that is at the source of all of life, and the Mahatmas, these sages, call this great one source of which we're all a part. We all have this divine, an element of the divine, and the ultimate source within each one of us. And they called it the absolute. They called it or sometimes the ultimate absolute. So this is a theme that runs through all the letters, that everything in life is interrelated, the great interrelatedness of life. Another subject that is brought up is the subject of evolution, not just physical evolution, but also evolution on emotional levels, mental levels, and also spiritual evolution. Creation, the subject of creation, and the idea that everything is cyclic, and that even our whole universe is cyclic, which is a fascinating subject. And some scientists are beginning to realize that today, that what we're experiencing is a reawakening of the universe. And then after a great, enormous period of time, everything goes back to the ultimate. And then after another period of time, enormous period of time of absorption of everything into the ultimate, then there's another reawakening. The subject of also the guru-disciple relationship, and chelaship it was called in those days, discipleship, and there's a lot of interesting gurus these days, and though of course in the Ageless Wisdom the emphasis is on finding our inner guru. So there's a lot of material on chelarship in these letters, which is very fascinating. There's also a lot of material in there on what happens at death, a life after life. Of course, they look upon death as not a period but a comma, as a period in between lives, because the idea of reincarnation is very strong in the East, and these Mahatmas who were writing to Sinet and Hume definitely believed in reincarnation. They could remember their own previous lives, and they could also tap into the previous lives of their chelas and disciples. So there's some very interesting material on life after life and the process of in-between lives, and there's also a lot of material on reincarnation and karma and the skandhas, as they're called, the tendencies that we come into life with, that follow us from other lifetimes. There's also a lot of material about science, because, you know, in those days there were a number of scientists who became very interested in the Ageless Wisdom. There was a lodge of Theosophists here in London. So I have a chapter in the book on science, and there's some interesting ideas in there on how to bring about a greater alignment and attunement between science and spirituality. So there's lots of chapters on different subjects. There are actually 50 chapters in the book based on topics that are in the letters, but they are the master's words. Now let me give you an idea of the saga as to how this all came about, because it does make an interesting story. All right, there were 4 individuals that were mainly involved in this extraordinary correspondence. All right, first of all, there were the 2 sages, and I have a rogues gallery here. The 2 sages, Himalayan sages, were known as Master Kutumi, though they didn't call themselves masters, by the way. That term masters was coined by Theosophists, but the term Mahatma is a word that is used in the East for advanced souls. It means great souls or advanced souls, but the term master came to be used. I'll explain why in a moment. So there were these 2 Himalayan sages. They both belonged to a Himalayan Brotherhood. So one of them was called Kutumi, and the other one was called Maurya. And both of them, both those names were not their real names. Those names were their mystical names, which they allowed their chelas to use. Interestingly, the name Kutumi, he chose that from these amazing myths in Hinduism known as the Puranas, and he chose that name. Why, I don't know, but it's the name of a character in the Puranas. And Maurya, the term Maurya is used for a whole dynasty of warrior princes in India. So they were their mystical names. Now, I want to just mention briefly, before I go into a bit more detail about these 2 sages, I want to mention that masters are those who have mastered, have had many incarnations and have mastered the physical, emotional, mental aspects of life. And they don't need to reincarnate anymore. They have mastered, they don't, the wheel of life and the wheel of birth and death and so on is not required of them any longer, but yet they have a choice to make. And many will choose to go into nirvana. They've earned to go into nirvana. I expect most of you know what nirvana is, but these particular masters and others, part of the Himalayan Brotherhood, chose not to go into nirvana as a sacrifice to stay closer to humanity and to help with the evolution and supervising and watching over the evolution of the consciousness of humanity. Not that they're allowed to interfere, because karma, they won't interfere with karma, but they can make suggestions and they can inspire people to get involved in missions to help humanity. Sorry, I'm in the wrong place. All right, so this is basically what masters are. They're also called bodhisattvas in Buddhism. So these 2 have made that sacrifice. And the Himalayan Brotherhood is part of a greater brotherhood and sisterhood, I should say, because there are female masters as well. They're not all in male bodies, but they've chosen to carry on in a physical body, and they've chosen to stay close, and yet they're not living, and they're not on the electric circuits of the world. They're not living in areas close to humanity. We don't know the precise location, but we do know that they were frequenting a number of monasteries in Tibet and in Ladakh, which was called Little Tibet and is now part of India. And one of the monasteries that's mentioned is Shigatse, the monastery of Shigatse, which was the base of the Panchen Lama. And they, in fact, met Blavatsky on a number of occasions. I'll talk a little bit more about Blavatsky in a moment, the Russian lady who was the founder of the Theosophical Society. And they actually tutored her. She spent 5 years altogether in Tibet, not consecutively, but at different times. And she was in the monastery of Shigatse and some other monasteries. Other monasteries are mentioned actually in the letters. So they frequented various monasteries, and they had their ashrams too, which mean holy places, where they were teaching and in close contact with various chelas and disciples. All right, a little bit more about Master Khatumi. He was a Kashmiri, and he in fact did a lot of traveling in Europe and attended some universities. He attended Hamburg University when he was in his 20s, and he also went to London. He was here in London, and London University as well as Paris. He could speak several languages, French, German and English, and he loved French. In fact, the Master Khatumi, Master Moria, who was very close to him, they worked very closely together, though they were very different energetically. The Master Moria used to call Khatumi my Frenchified friend, because he loved to use French phrases, and in the letters you'll see there are a number of French phrases that he used. He was very gifted from a literary point of view, and the language in the letters when Khatumi is writing is very beautiful. He was a very kind and one of these people that never like to hurt people's feelings and so on, and whereas Moria was a little bit more stern than Khatumi. Now, I want to mention now that the two individuals who are so fortunate to be able to have this opportunity to correspond with these two sages. We have, first of all, A.P. Sinnett. His name was Alfred Percy Sinnett, and he came from England and from a middle-class family. He had some hard times when he was a teenager because his father died when he was a teenager, and he had to support the family, his sister and his mother. And so he couldn't go to college. He had to work, and he worked as a printer. But then he discovered he had writing talent, and eventually he became a journalist. And in fact, he was a sub-editor and eventually editor of the Evening News here in London. And eventually he was offered a post in Hong Kong, and from Hong Kong he was offered a post in India for the Anglo-Indian newspaper known as the Pioneer in Allahabad. And he was a very successful editor in Allahabad. Now, the other person who corresponded with these two sages was Hume, A.O. Hume, Arthur Octavian Hume. Hume came from a very well-to-do family in England. His father was a parliamentarian, and in fact, though he was conservative, he did have, he was very interested in the human conditions and so forth, and he was well ahead of his time. He was very humanitarian, apparently. And Hume was sent out to India with the East India Company, and then he became a government official and eventually a magistrate up in northern India. So there he showed great courage during the British Raj when there was a mutiny up in Etawah in northern India. And in fact, as a result of that, he was awarded the highest award for bravery that was awarded in those times in England. It was called the Order of the Bath, or the Bath, wherever you come from in England, the Bath, all right. So he was a very courageous man, and also he was very interested in science as well as being a political figure. He is well known for having pioneered the Party of Congress in India, which eventually had a major part to play, along with Gandhi, in bringing about the independence of India. And by the way, those of you who are Theosophists, you know, a number of Theosophists became part of that Party of Congress, that Congress Party. All right, the other thing he was interested in was natural science. And he was very interested in ornithology, and he had an amazing collection. And his collection apparently ended up in the Natural History Museum here in London. Now, how did these two men, part of the British Raj, get to correspond with these two advanced souls? Well, it was triggered or sparked initially by them coming to know Blavatsky. Have you all heard of Helena Petrovna Blavatsky? She was a very enigmatic woman, Russian lady, well ahead of her time. And she was the founder, along with two other people, of the Theosophical Society in New York in 1875. And this society, which means, Theosophy means the wisdom of God, and it's the same as the Ageless Wisdom. This society was actually inspired by these two masters. Blavatsky, as a child, used to have visions of the Master Moria. By the way, the Master Moria was very tall, 6'8", and Kutumi used to call him my bulky brother. I think Kutumi was also pretty tall, but he wasn't quite as tall as Moria. So Blavatsky, she was very psychic as a child, being brought up in Russia, and she had these visions of this very tall individual and Indian gentleman who actually saved her life on more than one occasion. Now, she didn't get to meet him physically until she came to London. She was 20. Do you know, she was a wonderful concert pianist. She was a pianist. She could have had a great career as a concert pianist. She was a friend of Clara Schumann in London, and actually they shared the stage on one occasion. She was receiving lessons from Moscheles, the great pianist. And anyway, when she came to London, she was standing along in the Mall one day, and there was this procession of Indian Maharajas. Master Moria was actually a Rajput prince, and he was part of a group of Maharajas who were coming to visit Queen Victoria. Anyway, Blavatsky recognized him. They locked eyes, and he looked at her and he put his finger to his lips and restrained her. She was actually very devoted to him because he had saved her life on 2 occasions. She was about to throw herself at his feet, but you know, Mahatmas don't like being worshipped. Anyway, he totally restrained her. But the next day in Hyde Park, she got to meet him, and just the two of them sat down on a park bench, and he talked about work that she could be involved in the future for helping humanity. And the connection with Blavatsky. Now, Blavatsky, she was in New York, and later on, and founded the Theosophical Society there. But the Master Moria then inspired her to, and she also had befriended somebody by the name Henry Steele Olcott, who was also a joint founder of the Theosophical Society. He was a military man who then later became a journalist and befriended Blavatsky, and they had a lot in common. He was very interested in understanding more about the mysteries of life. He was also interested in spiritualism and so on. So he and Blavatsky were advised by the Master Moria to go to India and establish the Theosophical Society in India. But now Olcott, Henry Steele Olcott, was reluctant to go. He had ties in New York. And they were living together, him and Blavatsky. This is Blavatsky as a younger woman. And it wasn't a romantic thing. It was they had work to do together for the Theosophical Society. But they lived in this suite of this a large apartment which was called the Lamasery. And one night, before they went to India, Olcott was being very reluctant about all of this. One night, the Master Moria appeared to Henry Steele Olcott. He was sitting reading in his study. He had his own study. And the door was closed, and all of a sudden this very tall Indian gentleman with a great white turban on his head appeared in the room, as real as anything, and began to talk to him. He didn't say that he had to go to India, but he tried to inspire him and help him to see the good side of going to India. Anyway, he talked to him for about half an hour, and at the end of their conversation, and Olcott was in awe, and he was thinking at the end, how is anybody going to believe me that this has happened, that I've met the master? And then he began to unwind his turban, because he had read his mind, and said, I'm going to give you my turban, because then that'll help you realize that this has really happened, this is really me. And that turban now is in the international headquarters of the Theosophical Society in Adyar, which is in Chennai. They have a museum, and that turban still is there for people to see. All right, so that's a little bit of background on the individuals. And now the thing that happened was that Sinnett and Hume heard about Blavatsky, and she was visiting Simla, and she got to meet Sinnett and Hume, because Hume had a castle up in Simla, which was in the British hill station of Simla. It's where a lot of the British government officials went, in the summertime, because it was cooler. But Hume had a castle. He lived there with his wife Molly, and it was called Rosny Castle. And in the summertime, also Sinnett and his wife Patience used to go. They had a summer house there, and they heard about all these amazing things that were happening around Blavatsky, and they were both very interested in understanding more about the mysteries of life. They were Anglican Christians, but they had been delving into spiritualism and trying to find greater answers. Well, they knew that Blavatsky was in touch with the masters, and Sinnett, he wanted to dialogue with him in the worst way. So he went to Blavatsky and asked her, is there any way that I can enter into dialogue with the Mahatmas? And she said, well, I'll see what I can do. So first of all, she went to Moria and asked him if he would correspond with her. And he said, absolutely not. He didn't want to get involved. He had quite a stern side to him. And I think he thought some of these people in the British Raj were, they're probably very curious about things, but maybe not, deep enough into. He didn't want to get involved. But he did later on, and I'll explain why in a moment. And so then Blavatsky went to some of the other Mahatmas of the Himalayan Brotherhood. They also said no. But eventually, Khatumi, who I said he was a very kind, very soft nature, he agreed to. But he agreed to only on a temporary basis. And he had to get permission from a higher adept. Adept is another term for masters or Mahatmas. And in fact, they had their superiors. Once you're a master, that's not the end of it, by the way. There's always higher phases of evolution to go through. And Master Moria, Master Khatumi agreed, but both he and Moria had to answer to a higher adept. And in the Mahatma Letters, they call him the Chohan, which means Lord, Chohan, Chohan. And Khatumi had to go and ask his permission. And he said, well, you can do it on a temporary basis. This was just with Sinnett to begin with. Well, Blavatsky got back to Sinnett and said, well, one of the masters has agreed to correspond with you. Sinnett was so excited, he sat down and wrote not just one letter, but 2 letters. And he didn't know the name of the master, and so he addressed it to an unknown brother, right? Because they also termed themselves brothers. By this letter, he went to his friend Hume and showed him this letter. And so then Hume he wanted to get into the act as well. So he went to Blavatsky too and said, well, I would like to write. And he started writing letters too. But again, Master Khatumi had to go and ask permission. And eventually a permission was given for him to also correspond with you. So that's how the correspondence began with these two. Now, these two were not disciples. They were not practicing great disciplines. They liked their port after dinner, and they were meat eaters, etc. And they were married, etc. They're leading normal lives, a part of the British Raj, and so on. But the masters saw their potential. In fact, apparently, in the letters, they pointed out that Sinet had been watched by the Master Khatumi from before he'd even gone to India, because he was interested in spiritualism and he had a mystical side to his nature. And he points out that the masters, it's like they're up on a mountain and they're looking down into a valley and looking at humanity. You know, they have these abilities, these siddhis or powers, and they see now and again glimpses of light and potentiality amongst humanity. And then they can zero in with their particular siddhis, and they had done this with Sinet, and realized he had potential to be of help in the future for the Theosophical Society, and so he saw that he had this potential. Yes. So now I think time is moving fast. That gives you the main story behind. The letters went on for 5 years, but Hume, apparently, he had a very, very scientific mind, and he constantly was asking questions. Both of them did, but Hume was a bit more difficult. You know, with our Western education, we tend to be over analytical, and sometimes that gets in the way of our intuition. And sometimes he could be very difficult in forcing answers from the masters. They had to point out there's some things that we cannot burden you with because of where you're at in your spiritual evolution. Some of these teachings, you know, have to wait till people are more evolved and so on. But they did divulge a lot of details of certain teachings, like life after death, about discipleship and so on, about the difference between the intellect and intuition, also about the complexities of the human being, which they go into, about the sevenfold nature of man, because, you know, we only see, we're like an iceberg. You only see the top part of the iceberg. Everything else is underneath. And that's how human beings are. The other parts of our being, the subtler parts of our being, are not easily accessible. We have a divine immortal nature within us, and the masters go into the details of the inner parts of our being. So, you know, we have an animal nature too, an emotional nature, and we have mind, but we also have very creative mind, which is different from everyday mind, and we also have a divine part of our being. And so they explain all of that in their letters. And they explain the difference between spirit and soul, for instance. And so there's some wonderful teachings in the letters. Of course, has an esoteric side to it. They're based on the esoteric core of all philosophies. So yes, there's a lot of Hinduism in the teachings, but these particular masters, I would call them universalists. They could see the esoteric side and the benefits. They were not against any religion, but they were interested in the deeper side of religion, because religion means, I should have paraphrased the question. She wanted to know whether the teachings were based mainly on Hinduism. They're based on the esoteric side of all religions. For instance, Gnosticism, the deeper side of the esoteric side of Christianity, is mentioned. The Kabbalah is mentioned, which is the esoteric side of Judaism. and Buddhism, particularly the Mahayana, the northern Buddhism, but certainly a lot on Hinduism. They talk about the purest form of Hinduism is known as the Advaita philosophy. They do mention that, and they say that it's totally at one with the esoteric Buddhism. So they say there's a golden thread between all religions, and the reason why they started the Theosophical Society was to bring about greater understanding between different cultures and different religions. They were esoteric Buddhists, and I would call them universalists, because they did not, they saw the good in all religions to some extent. They also saw the delusions and the misconceptions that are developed in the religions. And in their chapter on, they do talk about the problems of evil, you know. There's a chapter on that. They go into that, and that religion does have a lot to answer for in that regard. But the esoteric side is really what they're teaching. There are so many, you're absolutely right. And there were others that were associated with Blavatsky and Olcott and the Chelas of that time. There was one that was called Etria. We don't know much about him. There was another one that they mentioned called the Prince, who was who's known as the Count Saint Germain, who is also incarnated as the Prince Rakosi. And there was the Master Hilarion, who's mentioned as the master who was involved with the Middle East and with Cyprus. He's mentioned as one of the masters as well. And yes, but these two particularly because they were the ones that took on this particular project of bringing about a revival of the ageless wisdom. So people would learn to tune into these deeper teachings and learn to express greater brotherhood and sisterhood in the world. Does that answer your question? I've told the story at the beginning, and I've taken chapters because the letters are not, they're not presented as themes as such. And so I actually, what I did was, it was really to help the study with the group I was connected with in Victoria in Canada, in Vancouver, on Vancouver Island. And in order to help myself understand the letters, I started finding out, well, what do they have to say about life after death? What do they have to say about chelaship? What do they have to say about evolution? I've compiled, it's a compilation. So it is their words, okay?
You've put together
yes.
the same topic from different letters.
That's right, from the 150 odd letters on the different, so make it easier for study purposes. So you are tuning into the words of the masters, and that's of spiritual benefit, I think, because they had high vibrations, and this helps us with our own, I think, our own spiritual development to tune into higher vibrations, and it helps with the expansion of consciousness. So, and I think that, interestingly, somebody by the name of Helena Rurik, who was also a great chela of the Master Moria, she was also a Russian, she said that the two spiritual books that she most recommended, she was living, she died in the 1950s, but she was writing to various disciples. The two books that she thought were the most helpful books were the Mahatma Letters and The Secret Doctrine by Blavatsky, which is also inspired by the two masters. And she said that these two would not be fully understood until the 21st century. And it is interesting to note, those books have never been out of print since they were published, ever, and that groups studying those two are increasing. And like The Secret Doctrine, you have all kinds of scientists now studying The Secret Doctrine in various universities, and you have all kinds of groups studying the Mahatma Letters now. So the interest in these books is increasing. So I think that what she said about them not being fully appreciated until this century, I think is worthwhile noting.